Hi everyone, so today I'll be doing another ISO comparison test, but this time in low light. And I'll be comparing the Canon RP against the Olympus E-M5iii, my Fujifilm X-T30, and the Nikon D750. So in my last test, I compared the Canon RP against my Olympus E-M5iii. And some of you had asked me, can I compare it against my Fujifilm X-T30 and Nikon D750? So I said, okay, yeah, I can do that. But another viewer actually pointed out that I should be doing these ISO tests in low light. And he pointed me to the DP Review site where they do their low light tests. And I looked at the M5 and they were shooting at f5.6 ISO 200 with a 1.6 second shutter speed. So I tried to get as close as I can to that. I actually ended up at ISO 200 f4.5 and shutter speed 1.6 seconds. So I'm actually 2/3 of a stop darker. And basically the setup was I set up a 40-watt bulb, pointed it at the ceiling, and I set up my scene over on a credenza in a dark corner. And I did this at night, so there's no ambient light coming in from the windows or anywhere else. The only light source was this one 40-watt bulb pointing up at the ceiling. So let's go through a little 2-minute montage here and we'll talk about that, and then also I'll do a basic dynamic range or exposure latitude test as well. Alright, so here's the scene split into the 4 different cameras side by side, and here's a punch at 100% roughly, so you can kind of pixel peep some of the noise. But at these base ISOs, you're really not going to see any noise on any of the cameras. They all do a really good job. Here you'll notice the Fujifilm missed focus a couple of times during this test, and I didn't get a chance to retake the image, but for the purpose of this video, I don't think that's quite as critical. But just to note that I found the Fujifilm didn't focus as well in low light as the other 3 cameras. And try and look at the shadow areas and the highlights. Look at the color chart here. See if you see any shifts in color as we move up the ISO scale. I really didn't notice a lot of difference up to ISO 3200. I mean, they were all pretty reasonable. But I think it's when we get here up to 6400 again, the larger sensors start to sort of shine here. And really, when we get closer to 25,000 ISO, they fall apart. But I think the Nikon is still doing the best job here. And then finally, on the last test, the E-M5iii doesn't have an ISO of like 51,000, so I was only able to test the other 3 cameras at this level. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do sort of a basic exposure latitude test where I underexposed the shots by 5 stops, 3 stops, and then I overexposed it by 3 stops. And what I wanted to show you is how much we can pull the shadows and maybe save the highlights without clipping between the different cameras. So we'll start with the M5iii, and I've underexposed this shot 5 stops. So to bring it back, I'm just going to pull the exposure back 5 stops, and then I'm going to slide the shadow slider all the way up and maximize that as much as we can. And I've already done this for all the other cameras, so let's go ahead and do a comparison. So first up, we have the Canon EOS RP, and even at full frame here, I think the E-M5iii did a better job at pulling the shadows, just like in the test last time that I did with these cameras. You can see there's definitely less noise on the EM5. However, when I'm doing this test in a little bit lower light, at least 2 1/3 stop lower than the last time, I don't think the difference is quite as stark. The Canon's doing a little better here, or maybe the M5 is doing a little worse, but I don't think the difference is quite as much as it was when I did the test last time. But there you have it. Like in here, you can see a little bit of the barrel threads here, where you can't make anything out in here. And up here in the corner, it's pretty close in the corner. All right, let's go to the next camera. And this is the Fujifilm X-T30. And wow, it really did a much better job. Look at that. I mean, there's noise, but there's not like a lot of color noise. It's mostly just in the details. So I'd say that Fuji definitely did a great job here. I think if I clean up the color noise on the E-M5 Mark III, they'll look pretty close because it seems like the detail is pretty good on both. Let me try that real quick. I'm just going to subtract some of the color noise just a little bit. I'll use the default setting. Let's compare it again. And yeah, the color noise is destroying the image, even though I reduced that. But good job, Fuji. Let's go to the next image, or let's move the Fuji over to the left and compare it to the last camera here, the D750. And yeah, the D750 definitely did a better job. I mean, at -5 stops and then recovering that, it's pretty amazing. It retained a lot of the detail here. Look at this photo album, the ridges here, and in here you can see definitely. However, I am seeing a little bit of banding in the shadow areas, whereas on the Fuji it's not banding, but it's, you know, it's lost a lot of detail. All right, let's move on. Next up are the I'm at -3 stops here, and again, I think definitely the Olympus did a better job, but it's not quite as big a difference as there was the last time I did this test in better light. So in lower light, the Canon is doing a little better than it was, or maybe the Olympus is doing worse, but definitely it's a little closer now than it was. Let's look at the Fuji. And yeah, definitely very, very clean image here. Even when we underexpose by 3 stops, I mean, most of the noise is gone. And it did save a lot of detail this time, more so than when we were 5 stops underexposed. So again, good job, Fuji. Let's move it over to the left and compare it against the D750. And yeah, now you can see the D750 is still holding up better than the Fuji. I mean, at -3 stops, there's almost no loss of detail. And I think the colors held up pretty well. Better than when we were at -5 stops, because I forgot to mention, when we were at -5 stops, it looked like we lost or the color kind of shifted a little bit on us. But definitely the Nikon wins again. All right, now in this scene I overexposed by 3 stops, so I'll just punch in -3 here, and I'll slide the highlight slider all the way down as far as we can go. All right, just as before, I did the same thing to the other cameras. Let's go ahead and punch in and look at the highlights. And I'm doing these at the base ISO for each camera, so we're getting the maximum dynamic range out of the sensor. And I'd say, again, just like last time, the Olympus did a better job at saving the highlights. Like, look at the barrel on the lens here versus here. You can see all of the grooves here, whereas on this one, a lot of them are blown out. Let's try over in this corner. Okay, over here it did good. And virtually no noise, and I wouldn't expect there to be any at this point. But yeah, still a win for the E-M5, but again, not quite as drastic as it was when we tested it before. So in low light, the Canon is doing better, or the EM5 is doing a little worse, but either way, the differences are not quite as great. All right, let's go to the X-T30. And yeah, I think the X-T30 did a slightly better job, because like look here on the dial here versus here, a little bit of the letter C is clipped off, whereas over here it's not clipped as much. And on the barrel of the lens, I'd say it's pretty close. Let's check some details here. Over here to the corners. I'd say this is almost a tie in terms of saving the highlights. Really close. How about the watch face here? Yeah, pretty much a tie. I mean, maybe the Olympus is a hair better here. But I'll call this a tie. All right, let's go over to the D750. And this was very surprising, or it might be surprising. It doesn't surprise me because I've had this camera a long time. But look how much is clipped off here on the Olympus, on the lens here. And then as I move over back to the Olympus pen, you can see all of this is clipped. Everything on the lens barrel, a lot of the face here, totally clipped. Let's try the corner here. Corner here looks okay. But again, this is not terribly bright over here in the corner. How about the paper? Wow, look at that. You can't even read any of the lettering here. But on here, on the EM5 Mark III, you can even almost make out some of the lines. You know, after looking at these tests, it reminded me that when I was shooting with the Nikon, I used to dial in an exposure shift across the board on that camera of -2/3 of a stop. Because other D750 owners were experiencing the same thing. And because I had read it in a forum, and a lot of them have said, yeah, just dial an exposure shift of -2/3 and you'll be okay. Because the way the Nikon sensor is, it seems to really save the shadows really well. I mean, -5 stops and I got almost back to a normal exposure. But on the highlights, definitely clippings. So thank you for suggesting doing these other tests against the other cameras, and also to redo this test in lower light, because you can definitely see that the cameras do behave a little bit differently in low light. Now I think across the ISO range, the differences were about the same as in good light. However, when we started to pull and push shadows and highlights, I think the behavior was different. Which showed between the EM5 Mark III and the Olympus RP, where the differences weren't quite as stark in low light. I think basically the RP was performing better, still not as well as the EM5 Mark III, but it definitely did better when the light started to drop. So if you have any other suggestions, or you'd like me to do any other tests, just let me know in the comments below. But either way, hopefully we'll see you again soon.